Grazie veramente per le gentili parole e grazie tanto ai organizzatori di questo evento. Mi dispiace veramente che non posso tenere la presentazione in italiano, ma purtroppo il mio italiano è abbastanza per questo. Ma se vuoi tutti i commenti dopo può essere in italiano e riesco a capire. Credo che se no funziona, ci sono altre persone che possono aiutarmi in questo. So I switch to English. Thank you very much again to the organizers of this. It's a great pleasure to be here. I will do a little bit of promotion in the beginning for the book. It has already been announced. So parts of my talk will relate directly to what I write in this book, which will be out hopefully in 2 weeks' time, and it will be out with De Gruyter in English, but there will also be a French and a Spanish version published by the ILO. And all of these will be open access. So if you want, have a little bit of patience and got interested into the topic, then this will be open access publication for you to get into. Okay, in my talk today, I will try to do two things. I will first spend a couple of words on some basic facts about the ILO and its history, and then I will try to structure my talk along three basic questions, which are at the same time the questions that also structure the book. And these questions are: whose organization is and was the ILO? So who does it represent? Whose work, what kind of workers does it represent? The second question, an international organization among international organizations. Actually, there should be a question mark also there. I will talk about in this part about the structure of the ILO, what distinguishes it as an international organization. And thirdly, I will talk about the question of the ILO as an organization for social justice. So first, a couple of words on the ILO. What is the ILO? It was founded in 1919, as already been said. We are in the midst of the centenary, actually we're in the midst also between the two founding moments. The first at the Paris Peace Conference, when the ILO, the idea of the ILO was put into a document, the founding document, the constitution of the ILO. And the other one is the first International Labour Conference, which took place in Washington, D.C. at the end of October 1990. The ILO is a UN specialized agency. It was founded as part, loosely attached to the League of Nations, and it is a tripartite organization, and that is actually what distinguishes it among all other international organizations in the UN family. So that means that governments, but also workers, trade union representatives and employer representatives take part on an equal footing in the decision processes of the ILO. What does the ILO do? So the classical field of action has been standard setting. So the definition, the adoption of international labor standards. From the first one in 1919, which established the 8-hour working day as an international norm, to the newest ones on domestic workers from, I think, 2011, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
And And
the recent one is the one.
And the recent one on violence and harassment in the workplace, adopted this year. And this is number 190. So the ILO has adopted exactly 190 international labor standards, many of which are technical standards, social security, occupational health, living standards, welfare provisions of various kinds. If you want to frame it in with regard to rights, the ILO standards represent an integrated approach to human rights. It contains classical political rights like freedom of association, freedom from forced labor, or freedom from discrimination, but it also embodies through its international labor standards the idea of social rights. And I think this is also fair to say that it's a unique feature of the ILO, that it represents this fully integrated approach to human rights. The second leg that the ILO rests on is the area of technical cooperation, technical assistance. Since the 1930s, it has been engaged in small-scale technical assistance operations. Since the 1940s, late 1940s, it does it on a much larger scale, and that means assistance in areas like vocational training, productivity, workers and management education, and many other parts. There is a little bit dry sounding area of social statistics. I think this cannot be emphasized enough. It's one of the most important areas where the ILO has been engaged with, and it is one of the reasons why the ILO survived also difficult times in the 1920s and 30s in the beginning, because it is a service provider in that area, and it is a place to go for by governments and also trade unions and employers, of course, to look for practices in other countries, best practices in other countries in areas like social security. It is also ultimately an institution that does research and education. It has two institutions, the International Institute for Labor Studies and the International Training Center at Torino in Italy. So what I would like to do before I get into the core historical part of the presentation is just to say 2 words on what the ILO is doing today from a historical perspective, of course, and I want to focus on the 2 areas of core labor standards and decent work. So core labor standards, according to the Declaration of Fundamental Principles and Rights at Work, define a couple of standards that are enabling rights, that are rights that apply to all member countries according to the Declaration of 1998, regardless of ratification, so by force of membership alone. This is freedom of association, the right to collective bargaining. This is forced labor. Discrimination also with regard to gender aspects, and this is child labor. As a historian, I would say this is a very important step, has been a very important step for the ILO in 1998 to increase its visibility. For me, it is a moment that is very interesting because it is deeply, deeply embedded in the broader context of the 1990s, of this period after the end of the Cold War, the discussions on trade liberalization, discussions on globalization, as well as human rights discourses at the time. It has been a defining moment in the treatment of international labor standards, a very controversial one at that, because it defined this core group of standards, which then, by definition, of course, are more important than other ILO standards. And this has not been taken easily by some in the organization, also by observers. The other thing following after that is the decent work agenda, launched after 1999 when the Chilean diplomat Juan Somavia became the Director General of the ILO, and it is the major heading of all the ILO's activities ever since. Decent work, what does it mean? This is a definition provided by the ILO, and I listed this also because, again, there's a lot of history in this couple of lines. So decent work sums up the aspirations of people in their working lives. It involves opportunities for work that is productive, delivers a fair income, security in the workplace, social protection for families, better prospects for personal development, social integration, freedom for people to express their concerns, organize, participate in the decisions that affect their lives, and equality of opportunity and treatment for all women and men. As a historian, again, I'm sorry for that. As a historian, I read this sentence as a sentence full of smaller histories, but big histories in its own right, histories of conflicts and controversies about human rights, about equal opportunity, protection of certain vulnerable groups of workers, but also discussions from the 60s and 70s about the humanization of work, which all enter this framework of decent work. And very often these are histories that at its core show conflicts about the limits of the ILO's mandate and of the inclusion of, or further exclusion, of course, of certain groups of workers and certain groups of work. And that brings me finally to my history of the ILO in 3 parts. And I want to start with the question of whose organization. So when the ILO was founded, and during much of its first decades of existence, it was, and you were good enough to write that on the invitation, it was an organization, to quote me here, I mean, it was an organization that was predominantly a European organization. It was mainly oriented towards industrial labor, and it was by and large a male-oriented organization. One might also add that in the absence, in the beginning of powers like the United States, who entered the ILO in the 1930s, and the Soviet Union, it's the same case, it was also an organization dominated by the great imperial powers of the time, which heavily influenced the way it treated colonial labor. And we must not forget that the colonies occupied a large part of the globe's territory in the 1920s and 30s, in Africa, in Asia, in other parts of the world. So much of what has happened ever since these beginnings is in a way a history of expansion, a history of extension of this original scope. So first of all, the ILO has expanded geographically. That's obvious from today's membership, if you compare it to the original membership. It first extended its scope to the Western Hemisphere in the 1930s, to the Americas, to Latin America, which mostly were members already from 1919, but who became new weight in the ILO's activities. But also with regard to the United States, I already mentioned that who entered the ILO other than the League of Nations in the 1930s under Roosevelt, and became very important to secure the survival of the ILO in the 1930s and during the Second World War. The crucial event with regard to geographical extension was decolonization. So as a result of which the ILO has become a much more global, much more diverse organization, from around 50 members in 1946 when it became part of the United Nations framework. It grew to over 120 members in 1965, and most of these new member states were ex-colonies and defined themselves as developing countries. And so these new majorities, they pushed the ILO to shift its interest, its emphasis in its working programs towards the problems of the less industrialized parts of the world. There's a second area of expansion, and that is with regard to fields of work and workers actually represented. So some questions accompanied the ILO from the beginning. So what kind of work actually qualifies to be treated by the ILO? It's not all work, it's not all kind of workers. To this day, there are groups that are outside the reach of the ILO, despite their character as workers. But in the 1920s, this initial process of expansion already began. The ILO started to include agricultural labor, intellectual labor. It also included migrant workers, refugees, and disabled workers. The later two groups, obviously, also as a direct reaction to the consequences of the First World War and its aftermath, and also to the Russian Revolution and the new order that had been created at Versailles. There's a changing treatment of women's work that goes over the entire 100 years. The ILO started to treat women's work as a separate form of work that needed special protection other than male labor. And from there it has shifted, without losing some of the protectionist or protective features, it has shifted much more after the Second War towards an emphasis on equality of opportunity. But this is obviously an ongoing struggle. And then the ILO in the 1970s, and that is a very important moment in time, has begun to take an interest in so-called informal work, informal economy, and in people working in, to use a more modern term, in non-standard employment. And of course, this applies also to more phenomena that we see more in industrialized countries today. I just learned today that there are considerations for a new convention on platform work for the regulation. I see you you are skeptical whether this will come about, but
we will discuss.
Yes, so. And this is also an
The informality is also in Italy, because il lavoro nero, 20% of the economy is informal in Italy, so it's not only of developing countries.
Yes, of course. And so it's fitting because it represents actually the core of the decent work agenda, which has an approach that to include all people that work, regardless of standard or non-standard, and where this work takes place at a workplace, in a factory or at home. whether it's domestic work, whether it's industrial labor, regardless. But, and I think that is part of the skepticism, regulation is something that is not easy to achieve, not only with regard to platform work, but with many other parts. So in this regard, back to the history, a question that accompanied the ILO actually from the start was, what should be the scope of the ILO's action? Should it take into account only the work of the worker at the workplace, or should it take into account the broader living conditions, including issues like health, like housing, like spare time, like cooperative modes of production and consumption? And related to it, should it reach out to the economic field, into development, into trade policy? So the ILO was actually instrumental in the 1930s, in the wake of the Great Depression, to promote Keynesian economics internationally. Very important. And so basically the question of scope, of competence, of fields of action had to be now and then answered by the member states. And in that sense, the crisis of Keynesianism in the 1970s, from the 1970s onwards, has translated in a crisis of the ILO's ideas of the relationship between the social and the economic. And it becomes most obvious here maybe that the history of the ILO's expansion is not a linear history. It's not a mere success story. There are conjunctures to certain topics, and there are drawbacks to the ILO's prospects of success. And it's worth, I think, to look into another anniversary the ILO celebrates a little bit subterraneously this year. This is 75 years of the Declaration of Philadelphia of 1944. And the Declaration of Philadelphia is a very important moment in time during the Second World War, when the ILO, on the side of the Allied powers, redefined its mandate and created a human rights foundation for the ILO's work. So the Philadelphia Declaration, in its core part, reads, all human beings, irrespective of race, creed, or sex, have the right to pursue their material well-being and their spiritual development in conditions of freedom and dignity, of economic security and equal opportunity. So the question of whose organization the ILO actually is answered here in the most comprehensive sense. So all human beings, not only workers, all human beings, and all policies are within the scope of the ILO, under a common social objective of all politics. And I would call that the Philadelphia consensus on which the ILO, it's a question, still rests, partly, maybe not. We can maybe discuss that later on. So I don't want to go any deeper into other aspects of whose organization the ILO actually is, but of course this also raises the question of power. Who actually is in command in the ILO? Who, in a Gramscian sense, exerts hegemony in the ILO? And maybe it's enough to say that power, of course, has never been absent. I see the ILO generally in a dual role. It is an arena for discussions basically between states, between nation states, like in any other international organization. An arena for this for power play. But it's also an actor in its own right, which tries to navigate these power constellations in the ILO. So the second question, an international organization among international organization. With this heading, I just want to say actually that the ILO does not exist in isolation. That's of course a truism. It does not exist in isolation, but it's part of a broader international, but also internationalist environment. So my argument is that being part of this environment and the networks that the ILO has been involved with, the broader internationalist network, but also the UN family, the League of Nations family, is always closely related to the world of nation states, which constitute international organizations, which sustain international organizations. There is no international organization outside of the general framework of nation states. That's, again, it's a truism, but I think one needs to emphasize it. So I get back to authors like Glenda Sluga, who has shown that there is no contradiction actually between internationalism and the world of nation states, but that they are mutually sustaining elements of the modern world that cannot exist without each other. So speaking about internationalism as an idea and as a strategy, the ILO is basically built on two internationalist traditions. First, there is the liberal, social liberal, bourgeois, if you want, tradition of social reformers represented in the late 19th century by the International Association for Labor legislation, which at the time lobbied governments to agree to international labor standards. It was successful in some areas as a complementary measure to social reforms on the national level. Basic idea behind international labor standards is to avoid turning these social reforms on the national level into a competitive disadvantage at the international level, vis-à-vis countries that would not follow suit, would not do the same. And there is a second tradition, which is the internationalism of the Second Socialist International, at least its reformist wing in the late 19th century and the early 20th century. The Second International, or Socialist and their trade union wing, were not easily convinced about the concept of international labor standards first. But they became more and more so in the early years of the 20th century, but they became the major driving force, and I think that is important to emphasize again, the major driving force behind the foundation of the ILO during the First World War. And that is because it was one of their demands in turn or in exchange as a gratification for their participation into the war effort in many countries in Europe, to found a permanent international organization that would adopt international labor standards, which would be binding on the member states. And to this day, the ILO rests on a blend of these two internationalisms. I would call it a social liberal internationalism. In the same sense, and I mentioned that before, what distinguishes the ILO from other international organizations is the idea of tripartism, the tripartite framework, the inclusion of workers and of employers. The ILO has invented tripartism. That would be my argument. Very actively promoted tripartism as a social model internationally. When the ILO was founded, there was very little experience, most of it from the First World War, from organizing the war economy, that could be built on. Trade unions, one has to recall that, were not safe in their position in many countries, not even in industrialized countries in Europe, everywhere. So for the ILO, tripartism was always a very important tool also to broaden its mandate, not to broaden its mandate, to broaden its networks on the national level, beyond the states. The ILO, and this leads us to, again, more to the present, relies on strong trade unions, and it relies on employers who take a genuine interest, actually, in the ILO's work and in this kind of cooperation. So whether one can speak of a crisis also of tripartism today is an open question that maybe you will be better equipped to answer. But maybe to collect as the standard bearer of this blend of internationalism, this social liberal blend of internationalism, and as a tripartite organization, the ILO has faced major challenges through its history. It was not uncontested, of course, and it survived in the main three major challenges. The first in the 1920s and 30s by strong alternative internationalisms, fascism and National Socialism in the main. After the Second World War, in the context of the Cold War and decolonization, when the tensions between different models of organization of society reached the debates within the organization. And the last one, and still ongoing one, I would argue, is what has been described as the neoliberal turn of the 1980s, which has laid the axe on some of the major principles on which the ILO's work rests. So I will conclude with the third question. An organization for social justice. So social justice, however vaguely defined it has always been, was from the beginning at the heart of the ILO's ideology, if you want. And in this final part of my presentation, I want to go back to some of the principles that the ILO builds on, parts of its constitution or of the Declaration of Philadelphia, which in turn has become after that part of the constitution. The first of this is one of the key sentences in both documents, whereas universal and lasting peace can be established only if it is based on social justice. So this phrase refers to peace both between nations and within societies. And this phrase in 1944 in Philadelphia had a very special sound to many participants of that conference during the war. So many felt at the time that it had been the failure of liberal democracy to address the consequences, the social consequences of the Great Depression that had facilitated the rise of fascism in the 1930s, which had led the world into another war. So the participants in Philadelphia, they were inspired partly by the example of the United States, of the New Deal under Roosevelt, which represented an alternative of an active state, and a state that invested in social security and in public work schemes to fight unemployment, but within an open economy framework. So what most of the participants in Philadelphia subscribed to was that social justice was a precondition not only for peace, but for the stability of democratic government. And this is obviously something that resonates in today's world, in which populist movements all over the place take part of their strength of the very real experience of social inequalities. And this, of course, poses a threat to democracy itself. Another sentence positioned very prominently in the Philadelphia Declaration, as well as in a slightly modified form in the first constitution, where it read, "Labor is not merely a commodity," which is a different thing if you look to it. The meaning is that labor cannot and it must not treat it be as a commodity, because it is part of the human condition, it is part of human dignity. So this encapsulates the core social liberal and the core humanist message that the ILO has. And of course, we all know that the decommodification of labor obviously has always been more of an ideal, more of an idea to strive towards than it is a reality. So taken together, and I will conclude with that, social justice, the social justice theme opens a couple of windows on important discussions in the ILO. The ILO has been founded as an organization that has been out to tame the forces of capitalism without removing capitalism. It is part of a history of capitalism. It is part of a history of the management of open economies, and the ILO has been always decidedly reformist, a non-radical, a non-revolutionary organization. It is a mirror and is an indicator for the great transformation that Karl Polanyi has observed in the period of the Philadelphia Declaration. And if you allow me, I will introduce one last quotation from both documents, Constitution and Declaration of Philadelphia, which reads, "Poverty anywhere constitutes a danger to prosperity everywhere." And this phrase, once again, contains the major rationale behind international labor standards, but most of all, it points to the interdependence of the national and the international system. In 1944, it also put on display the interest the ILO was about to take in development issues. It added strength to the claims for an economic mandate for the ILO. And it translated the social objective of all policies to the international sphere. And once again, and I conclude with that, with regard to the current discussions, for example, on migration, it could well be read as a commentary on present issues.